I'm a ranger, and I raised Bigfoot from when he was born like my own son. But on his 13th birthday, something happened that changed everything forever. From that moment, my life took a turn for the worst. And what the Sasquatch did on that day is the darkest thing I've ever experienced that has haunted me every day since. 22 years in the Cascades as a backcountry ranger teaches you something no formal training covers: the difference between terrain that has been used by animals and terrain that has been used by something else. I had been filing observations for 15 years before I found him. 15 years of noticing and recording and setting the recordings aside in a mental file I did not know how to label. After his 13th birthday, I understood what the file was for. I was 41 when I found him. By 41, I had made enough observations about the backcountry to trust them. I was not a person who was startled by conclusions. I was a person who had spent 2 decades learning the difference between what I was seeing and what I thought I was seeing, and that learning had produced in me the particular kind of patience that long-term field work produces. A willingness to hold an observation open, to resist closure, to let a thing mean what it means rather than what is convenient. What I found under the blowdown cedar in April was going to require every bit of that patience and more. I found him in early April, 3 weeks after snowmelt, on the south-facing slope of a drainage I had been monitoring for black bear activity. I was running camera checks, 12 cameras positioned through the lower corridor, working my way east from the trailhead, pulling cards, noting battery levels, resetting angles where the winter had shifted the mounting hardware. The work was routine in the way that field work is routine when you know it well, not unconscious but familiar, occupying only the portion of attention it required and leaving the rest free. The drainage was quiet in the way April drainages are quiet. Ice out on the creek, the flow higher and louder than any other month, the canopy not yet leafed enough to filter the light, so the floor of the forest had a bleached, exposed quality that it loses by June. It was a clear, cold, structural morning, the kind where the landscape presents itself without ambiguity, where everything that is there can be seen. I smelled him before I saw him. Not a bear smell, though I know bear smell the way I know coffee smell. Immediate, categorical, not something you misidentify. Not a deer smell, which is lighter and grassier and carries differently in cold air. This was different from both. Heavier, organic in a way that was almost mammalian but pitched at a register I had no file for. Not outside my experience the way synthetic smells are outside it, but outside my experience the way a variation on something familiar is outside it. Familiar enough to catch attention and different enough to hold it. I stopped walking the way you stop when information arrives faster than interpretation. Just a full stop, weight on my back foot, hand moving toward the radio before my mind had finished deciding why. He was under a blowdown cedar, maybe 40 feet off the trail, in a depression the root ball had opened when the tree went over some years before. The exposed root mass was gray and weathered, the wood of the trunk softened to the punky consistency of long-dead timber. He was in the center of the depression, in the part that was still bare mineral soil, and he was curled. Small enough that my mind initially tried to organize him as a bear cub. The size was close, the coloring was close in the low light. The stillness was the right kind of stillness for a sleeping animal in cold weather. He was curled the way cold animals curl, compact and minimized. That much fit the frame I had available. But the frame did not hold. Bears do not curl with one arm, and I registered the word arm before I had any business using it, folded under the head like a pillow. Bears do not have the proportions that made my eyes keep sliding off him and back to him. The width of the shoulders relative to the length of the torso, the unusual length of the fingers where the hand curled at the edge of the depression, the hair that was not bear hair, something different entirely, less coarse, more organized in its direction of growth. I noticed all of it without being able to hold it. As a conclusion, because a conclusion requires a category, and I did not have a category to sort into. I stood there for a long time. Long enough that my breath had slowed and the cold had settled into my forearms. I was running calculations that weren't adding up. What is this? What do I do? What happens next? And underneath all of them, the one I couldn't frame as a question yet, in 22 years in this terrain. He woke up while I was standing there. The waking was gradual, the way a young animal wakes. Environmental assessment running below the surface before the eyes commit to opening. The body making decisions about what it is waking into before it declares itself awake. The breathing changed first, becoming more deliberate. The posture shifted slightly, not a movement so much as a change in the quality of the stillness. Then the eyes came open, and they found me immediately. Not the scanning search of an animal locating a sound, not the startled, defocused look of something surprised, mid-sleep, directly to my face, which meant whatever was doing the locating had already located me before the eyes were needed, had been running its own assessment, noting my position, my stillness, my smell, reaching a preliminary conclusion. The opening of the eyes was confirmation of a process that had been running longer than it appeared. What passed between us in that first moment of eye contact was something I can only describe as recognition. Not recognition in the sense that we had met before. Recognition in the deeper sense, the mutual acknowledgement of two things that are both present in the same space and both aware of being present and both engaged in deciding what that means. The difference between that and what happens when you lock eyes with a deer or a bear in the backcountry is considerable and not subtle. With a deer, you are a stimulus the deer is responding to. With a bear, you are a potential threat or resource, and the bear is calculating which. With what was looking at me from that depression under the blowdown cedar, I was neither. I was a participant in a situation both of us were in together, and the eyes were doing what eyes do in that kind of situation, gathering information in service of a relationship rather than a reaction. He was injured. The right shoulder was held wrong, a compensating angle, the kind of adjustment a body makes when weight on a joint is producing pain. The fur was matted on the right side in a way consistent with a wound. Later, I would be able to see it more clearly. A deep laceration from the shoulder blade down toward the mid-back, not fresh, but not old, probably from a fall on the rocky exposed slope above the drainage where the snowmelt had made the granite into a sliding surface with no friction and a very long run out to the valley below. I made a decision in the next 60 seconds that I have spent 12 years examining from every angle available to me, and I have never found a version of it that was wrong, even though I have found many versions that were complicated. I sat down, cross-legged, on the wet April ground with my pack behind me, the trail 40 feet to my right. Not the distance of approach, not the distance of retreat. The distance of someone who has arrived at a particular point and stopped and is now making themselves part of the landscape rather than an event in it, waiting to see what the landscape does next. He watched me for 20 minutes before he moved. The move was not toward me and not away from me, but a repositioning, a shift of weight that brought the injured shoulder up and out of the depression's cold ground. He knew the cold ground was making it worse. He knew it the way an animal knows discomfort. But the repositioning was deliberate in a way that was not purely instinctual, not the reflexive jerk of a sleeping animal changing position, but a considered movement made after a period of wakefulness. The information it gave me about his intelligence was information I filed without knowing what filing cabinet it belonged in. I came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The patience the 12 days required is not dramatic patience, not the patience of enduring something difficult, but the patience of removing yourself as a source of urgency from a situation that already has enough urgency built into it. The patience of being reliably present without being reliably demanding. I had practiced versions of this patience in the field with injured wildlife, raptors, the occasional mustelid. What the 12 days of approaching him required was different in degree from anything I had practiced before, because what I was practicing it with was different in kind from anything I had practiced it with before. The second morning I arrived before first light. I had not planned to. It was not a strategy I had worked out in the hours between the first visit and the second. It was simply what happened when I woke at 4 in the morning with the particular alertness that is not insomnia, but its opposite. The alertness of a mind that has been given something real to attend to and is attending to it with everything it has. I dressed in the dark. I walked the 2 miles to the drainage in the gray that precedes the gray that precedes the light, and I took my position at the sitting distance, and I waited for the drainage to become visible around me. He was already awake when the light arrived, or rather, he had been awake before I arrived, which I understood from the quality of his stillness when the light finally made him visible. the particular quality that belongs to a being that has been in one position for a long time and has settled into it rather than maintained it. He was watching the tree line to the east, not watching me, watching the direction from which the light was coming, as if the arrival of the light was something he had opinions about and was in the process of forming them. I sat for 3 hours that morning without being looked at once. I did not take this as discouragement. I took it as information of a different kind, information about the nature of the attention I was dealing with, which was attention that did not owe me anything and was not going to perform acknowledgement it did not feel. What I was in the presence of was a being that would look at me when it decided to look at me, and not before. And the only variable I controlled was whether I was there to be looked at when that decision arrived. So I stayed. And at the end of the 3rd hour, he turned his head and looked at me for approximately 4 seconds and then looked back at the tree line. 4 seconds. I filed it the way I filed everything. I walked back to the residence and ate and made notes and went to bed early and woke at 4 the next morning with the same alertness and did the same thing again. On the 3rd day, I brought food. High calorie, dense, nuts, dried fruit, the kind of energy delivery a healing body needs in volume. I left it at the margin of the depression and withdrew to my sitting distance and watched him decide about it. The deciding took 40 minutes. The approach took another 15, a body length at a time, with pauses between each movement that I timed in my head because I knew better than to check my watch. The eating, when it came, was efficient and thorough. He ate everything. Then he went back to his side of the depression and looked at me. By the end of the 12 days, he was taking food from my hand. I will not say that casually because it is not a casual thing. The first time a wild and injured being decides that your hand is a safe location. The weight of his hand when it closed over my fingers was substantial and warm and made contact with my palm in a way that landed as information before it landed as sensation. This is what it weighs, my palm reported. This is how warm it is. This is the grip strength when it is not trying. The information arrived and I filed it with everything else in the cabinet I had not yet found a label for. On the 12th day, he put his hand on my knee while he was eating and did not remove it for the duration of the meal. His hand was larger than mine. He was, by my best estimate at the time, somewhere between 8 and 14 months old. I filed a report with the district office. I used the language the reports require, described what I observed using the available categories, and noted where those categories did not fit. The district coordinator said it sounded like a bear cub. I said it did not present as a bear cub. He said, keep monitoring and file a follow-up. I did. A wildlife biologist arrived, spent 4 hours in the drainage, and the inquiry eventually went quiet without resolution in either direction. There is a version of what happens when institutions encounter something they have no category for. That involves the institution deciding not to have encountered it. I understand the instinct. I had practiced it myself. I just had the disadvantage of having already spent 12 days sitting on the floor of a drainage with my hand extended, and the hand had been taken, and you cannot unfeel the weight of that once you have felt it. By that point, it did not matter anyway. He was already living with me. He followed me home on the 31st day. Not on the 1st day or the 12th, but on the 31st, when I finished the morning session at the Blowdown Cedar and walked the 2 miles back to the trailhead, and then the half-mile on the access road to the ranger station residence where I had lived alone for 7 years. I was inside and had started the coffee when I heard the sound on the porch. Not a knocking. I want to be clear that it was not a knocking. It was a weight settling onto the porch boards. A specific creak in a specific location I knew as the northeast corner, the weak board I had been meaning to replace for 3 winters and never had. I opened the door. He was sitting on the northeast corner of the porch with his knees pulled up and his injured shoulder toward the wall, the position he had been using in the depression when he wanted to protect the shoulder from pressure. The shoulder was healing, the wound had closed, and the surrounding fur had begun to grow back around the margins. But the body had learned a protective posture and was still using it out of habit, the way bodies hold on to protective postures longer than they are strictly needed. He looked at me with the expression I was still, 6 weeks in, not able to name accurately. Not an animal's look and not a person's look, but something that occupied the territory between those 2 categories, something I did not have a map for. He did not look like he was asking for anything. He did not look like he was waiting to be told something. He looked like he had made a decision and was in the process of carrying it out. And what I did next was information he was gathering, but not information he required to have already received. I left the door open. I went back to the coffee. I moved through the kitchen the way I moved through it on ordinary mornings, without performance and without the kind of studied casualness that would itself become a performance. I stood at the window that looks out over the access road and watched a pair of ravens work the meadow on the road's far side, and thought about what I was going to have to do in the practical sense if the porch situation became a permanent situation, which some part of me already knew it was. He came inside 20 minutes later. He has never left. I am going to give you the shape of the first 3 years rather than the detailed account, because the detailed account would require its own full telling, and what I am telling you is the story of his 13th birthday. But the first 3 years are background to everything that follows, and background without weight produces foreground without context. He grew at a rate that was not human and was not any animal species I had records for. By his 3rd year, I was no longer trying to fit him into any existing category. The categories had failed comprehensively enough that I had set them aside entirely and begun simply observing what was in front of me, which is the practice that 22 years of fieldwork had trained me for, and which turned out to be exactly the right practice for what he was. The residence required modification, the removal of interior walls between the guest room and the storage room and the mudroom, which a contractor friend completed over a long weekend and asked no questions about, which produced a space of roughly 800 square feet that he could move through without compressing himself, with a ceiling height of 9 feet opening onto the back of the property through a door I had widened. The modification changed the structure of the residence, and it changed the structure of my life, and I'm not going to characterize either change as a sacrifice, because sacrifice implies an accounting that I was never running. I had a being in my care. The being required a space. I made the space. That is the full ledger entry. He ate what I cooked and what he foraged. The foraged component of his diet was enormous, a body running a significant caloric requirement, and a forager who knew the drainage completely, at the level of individual plants and individual rock outcroppings and individual sections of creek margin where specific things could be found at specific times of year. He knew the drainage the way the drainage knew itself, accessing it through sensory channels I did not have. I taught him things. I taught him the trails, not the instinctual familiarity of an animal learning a territory, but the systematic knowledge I carried, a connected network with named sections and intersections and the logic of how the sections related to each other. I taught him the camera positions and the monitoring protocols and the difference between fresh sign and old sign. I taught him to use the maps, which he found straightforwardly legible in a way that suggested his capacity for spatial representation was not something I was introducing, but something I was merely giving a new format for. I taught him the seasons as the district experienced them, not the broad seasonal knowledge of any creature that lives through a year, but the specific seasonal knowledge of a managed landscape. When the trail crews came in, when the permit holders ran their stock through the upper drainages, when the hunters arrived in the fall, and which corridors they preferred. When the researchers from the university set their own cameras in the burn zones to the north, and what their presence meant in terms of the days we did not go to those sections. He absorbed this the way he absorbed terrain, not as a list of facts, but as a living map, something he inhabited rather than memorized. There were things he taught me in return, though teaching is not quite the right word for a process that operated entirely without instruction. He taught me to slow my reading of a drainage by demonstrating what a slow reading looked like, standing at the margin of a section of creek for 20 minutes, not scanning, not moving, receiving information at a rate that my trained field habit of continuous movement had never allowed. The first time I stood beside him through one of those 20-minute readings and then looked at what he looked at afterward, I understood that I had been moving through this terrain for 22 years, the way you move through a book by reading only the chapter headings. What he was reading, standing still at the creek margin, was everything between. He learned to move without sound, which took no teaching because he arrived knowing it. He learned to move without leaving sign, which is different and is a skill even experienced backcountry rangers take years to develop. He learned to be still at the right times and to move at the right times, and the difference between those two times, which is judgment rather than instinct. I named him Caleb in the 2nd month, when I understood he was staying, and I needed something to call him that was not it, or the animal, or the subject. I named him Caleb because it was the name that arrived when I needed one. I have always believed that names matter less than the relationship they are applied to, and more than we tend to think in the moment of applying them. I did not call him Bigfoot, I did not call him Sasquatch or any word from the available lexicon of disputed accounts and campfire arguments. Those words would have located him in a category of things people argue about, rather than a category of things people are responsible for. In the second month, watching him sleep in the modified rooms with the September morning light coming through the contractor friend's widened doorway, I understood that the word for him was whatever word applied to something in your care. Something you had found injured and sat beside for 12 days and now got up in the night to check on when the temperature dropped and the wind came up from the valley. He accompanied me on trail work when the district was empty, which in the deep winter months was most days. He did not accompany me when the district had visitors, which we had worked out through a process I can only describe as negotiation. Not verbal negotiation, but the kind that happens through approach and withdrawal and adjustment and approach again, through the accumulation of instances into something like policy, through the mutual recognition of a limit and the mutual agreement to respect it. He understood that visibility in populated areas was a problem. The distinction between how he understood it and how I understood it matters less than people think. The limit was the same, regardless. I understood things about him that I will not understand about anything else I ever encounter. The difference between his stillness when he was listening and his stillness when he was simply present. The sound he made when he was content. The sound he made when he was interested. The sound he made, which I heard only twice in 11 years, when he was genuinely afraid. He was afraid of fire, not the theoretical fear of open flame that most animals carry as a deep-wired response, but a specific, calibrated fear of uncontrolled fire that expressed itself as immediate withdrawal from any situation involving a campfire or a burning stove. He was afraid of the state road at the eastern boundary of the district where the logging trucks ran at night. He was not afraid of the creek in high water, even when the current was dangerous. These distinctions assembled a picture of a being that had learned its fears from specific experiences rather than inheriting them from instinct, which is a distinction that has taken me years to feel the full weight of. The state road fear I came to understand better in his 6th year, when I found the remains of what appeared to be a large primate, not him, the dimensions were wrong, the remains were old, in the brush at the road's eastern shoulder, 2 miles north of the district boundary. I did not file a formal report. I took measurements and photographs and added them to the notebook that was not the district notebook. I did not tell him what I had found, which is a sentence that requires me to acknowledge, as I write it, that the concept of telling him things was a concept I was already operating with by his 6th year. That the relationship had developed to a point where information felt like something to be shared or withheld, which is not a framework you apply to an animal. He knew something had changed in me when I returned from that section of road. He sat with me in the kitchen that evening for 2 hours without either of us doing anything in particular, which was its own form of the telling. I understood that he remembered things, not the episodic human memory of events strung on a timeline, but a deeper retention, the kind of memory that becomes the body rather than residing in the mind. Terrain he had walked once was terrain he knew permanently. He remembered the people he had seen at a distance during the periods when the district had visitors, and his behavior changed in proximity to those areas for weeks after the last visitor had gone. The memory was in the body, the way knowledge of terrain is in the body of an animal that belongs to that terrain, not recalled, but inhabited. I understood that he was kind. By kind, I do not mean gentle in the passive sense of something that lacks the force to be otherwise. He was not gentle. He was immensely strong in a way that he was aware of and calibrated continuously and carefully in every context where force was a variable. By kind, I mean the active form of the word, the form that requires awareness of the other and adjustment of the self toward what the other needs, rather than what would be easiest for the self to produce. He was kind to the cattle dog mix named Roper that I brought home in his 4th year. Roper was afraid of him for approximately 1 week, and then was not afraid, and the transition happened on a Thursday morning when Caleb sat down on the kitchen floor and stayed there for 45 minutes, while Roper circled closer and closer, neither inviting nor withdrawing, simply present, until Roper walked up and put his nose against Caleb's knee, and then lay down. The method Caleb used was the same method I had used at the blowdown cedar. He had watched me use it. He had understood it. He had applied it. He was kind to the injured animals I brought home for rehabilitation, the raptors and the mustelids, and the one black bear cub whose mother had been killed on the state road in Caleb's 7th year. He would sit with them in the recovery space, at a distance close enough to be present and far enough to be not pressure, and he would stay there for as long as the injured animal needed him to stay, which he seemed to know by some reading I did not have access to. I watched him do this dozens of times over 11 years, and I have never found a vocabulary for what I was watching, except to say that it looked like what a being who understood suffering would do if it decided that company offered. Without demand was the relevant response. I want to say clearly that I loved him. I want to say it plainly and early enough in this account that it is not news when I say it again later, because what happens on his 13th birthday cannot be understood through any other frame. I loved him the way you love something you have watched grow from injury to wholeness, from wariness to trust, from a thing that was curled under a blowdown cedar in cold mineral soil into something that walked the ridgelines with me in the dark like the ridgelines were his, and I was invited. The love was not uncomplicated. Love of something you do not fully understand is never uncomplicated, and I will never fully understand what he was. I accepted that in the 2nd year and have not re-examined the acceptance. The complication does not diminish the love. It is simply part of the texture of it. He turned 13 in early April, 3 weeks after snowmelt. Almost exactly 12 years from the morning I found him in the drainage. His birthdays were not marked with ceremony. He had no concept of birthday as a category that belonged to him. What we did on his birthday each year was what we did on all the mornings he accompanied me into the field. We walked the corridor together, 8 miles, 3 hours in normal conditions, west from the residence to the main drainage, then north along the bench trail to the Ridgeline Junction, then east on the Ridgeline route back to the trailhead and home. We had walked it together since his 3rd year, and we had developed over years the rhythms that two beings develop when they share terrain long enough. The pace adjustments, the positions relative to each other on the trail, the silences that are companionable rather than empty, the stops that are mutual and need no explanation. We left at first light. I was watching the morning come in the way I always watched it. The first gray, then the color, then the full light that brings the detail. And I don't know if I was watching more carefully because something in the morning was different, or because I tell myself it was different now that I know what it produced. The residence was the same as every other morning departure. I had coffee while he moved through the back section of the modified rooms with the particular economy of something that knows its own dimensions and the dimensions of the space around it. He ate before we left, a large quantity, as he always ate before a corridor walk, the body loading itself for the expenditure it knew was coming. He waited at the widened back door while I checked the pack: radio, first aid, the notebook, the camera card reader I was carrying for a scheduled pull on the Eastern cameras. Everything I always carried. Nothing that morning suggested the morning was going to require anything other than what it already contained. I remember the light on the access road as we walked to the trailhead. Low and lateral, the kind of April morning light that makes the wet road surface throw back a cold glare and makes the meadow to the east look like it is lit from inside rather than above. He walked on the road shoulder in the grass, the way he always walked when we were in a zone that could occasionally receive early traffic. Not concealment exactly, more the habit of operating at the edge of things rather than in the center of them. The habit of a being that had spent 12 years understanding where its presence was and was not a problem. The habit had become so natural by his 13th year that I rarely thought about it. That morning, I thought about it. I watched him walk the shoulder in the lateral April light, and I noticed the way you notice things you have seen so many times they have become invisible and then suddenly become visible again, that the habit was also a kind of grace, the same calibrated awareness of the world and his place in it that I had been watching for 12 years, expressed in something as ordinary as the side of a road. What I can say is that he was not the same walking beside me that morning. There was something in the quality of his attention, directed outward in a sustained and general way, rather than the specific, responsive alertness of an animal tracking something in its environment. That morning, the alertness was prior to any stimulus I could identify, as if the perception and the attending to it were already underway in him before the morning had produced anything for them to attend to. We made the ford at the creek without incident. The water was high with snowmelt, April cold, moving fast over the stones. He crossed on the downstream side the way he always crossed, using his height to manage the depth. I went over on the stepping stones as always. We came together on the far bank and continued northeast toward the drainage. The sound came from above us, from the ridgeline to the north. I want to be precise about this in the way I am precise about all the sounds I have spent 22 years cataloging. It was not an animal sound and not an environmental sound. It was percussion, the deliberate single-impact sound that is not a falling tree and is not a rockfall and is not a branch break and is not any other category of sound that terrain produces on its own. Low, deliberate, the sound of something solid brought down against something solid with intention behind the bringing. It repeated once, a pause of 3 or 4 seconds, and then stopped. He stopped walking. I stopped with him, because when he stopped in the field, I stopped in the field. That was part of the working agreement we had developed over 9 years of walking the corridor together. His stops were information. In 9 years, they had always resolved into something. A sound I subsequently heard, a scent I subsequently smelled, a movement in the trees I subsequently saw. His stops were not precautions. They were responses to perceptions that arrived before mine, and I had learned to treat them as the leading edge of information I was going to receive. We stood in the creek bottom, the water sound behind us, the drainage opening ahead, and he was oriented toward the ridgeline with an attention that had no complexity in it. All of his attention in one place and none of it anywhere else. Not scanning, fixed. The way attention fixes when it has already found what it is looking for, and the finding is not a question, but a confirmation. He made a sound I had never heard him make before. In 11 years of living with him, I had cataloged the sounds he produced with the same care I cataloged everything else. The low, resonant exhalation of contentment, the staccato clicking of interest in something small and specific, the long, falling vocalization I had heard only twice that meant fear past the threshold of regulation. I knew them all. This was none of those and not a combination of those. What came out of him standing in the April Creek bottom was something I had no file for. Not loud, not alarmed, structured in a way that distinguishes it from animal vocalization, the alarm call, the mating call, the territorial call, each recognizable by type rather than content. This was a sound that had internal organization the way a sentence has internal organization. That went somewhere rather than simply expressing a state. That produced a shape in the air between its beginning and its ending. It was answered from the ridgeline, from the direction of the percussion. The same register, not the same pitch, but the same underlying register, recognizable as belonging to the same category of sound, the way two voices in the same language are recognizable as belonging to the same language, even if the words are different, a different pattern. And then a silence that felt different from the silence before it, the way a silence after a conversation feels different from a silence before one. Something had been exchanged. Something was now different about the information state of the situation. I want to be honest about what I understood in that moment. He has always known something I have not known, not in the way of secrets. He was not keeping something from me in the way that implies withholding, in the way of a thing that simply existed beyond my perception range, the way the sound that brings a dog to the window from a dead sleep exists beyond human hearing and is not kept from us, but simply is not in the frequency range we operate in. What he had always known was that there were others in this corridor. What this morning was the morning when the others had come close enough to speak to. That understanding arrived complete. It was given. He looked at me. This is the part I come back to most often in the month since his birthday, the part I have replayed the most times and examined from the most angles. What I can say with confidence is this: he looked at me in the way he looked at me when he was checking. Something, some variable in the environment or the situation, some piece of information he needed before proceeding. And then he looked back at the ridgeline, and then he looked at me again. The back and forth lasted approximately 15 seconds, and within those 15 seconds, something was resolved in him, some calculation completed, some assessment finished and acted on. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. He had put his hand on my shoulder hundreds of times in 11 years. The gesture was familiar, But the quality of the gesture that morning was different from its quality in the previous hundreds of times in the way that the same words said in a different context carry a different weight. It was not the casual contact of a being at ease near another being. It was deliberate, attended. The contact of a being who is communicating something without words to a being it knows cannot receive the communication any other way. And then something changed in him. Something I had no prior observation to match it to, no file that fit its shape, no field note that prepared me for it. The hand on my shoulder tightened. Not the way it tightened when he was steadying himself on uneven terrain. Not the way it made contact when he was drawing my attention to something in the trees or the creek margins. This was a different quality of grip entirely. The grip of a thing that was not calibrating anymore, not adjusting to what I needed, not doing the continuous awareness of the other that I had spent 12 years recognizing as the defining quality of his kindness. The calibration had stopped. Something underneath it had come forward. I did not have time to understand what was happening before it was already happening. The force that took me off my feet was not the force I had any referent for. I had spent 12 years understanding in an abstract way that he was immensely strong. I had watched him move down timber that would have required a crew and equipment, watched him manage the creek crossings in high water the way you manage something that simply does not have the option of being stopped. I had cataloged the strength the way I cataloged everything else, as information, without ever receiving it as something that applied to me. That morning, it applied to me. I went down hard against the root mass of a blowdown at the drainage's edge, 20 feet from where I had been standing, with no memory of the transit between the 2 points, which is the way the body processes impact it is not prepared for. The air left my lungs in a single compression. The back of my head met the wood of the root mass. The world went briefly white, and then came back with the particular sharpness of a mind that understands it is in danger and is sending everything it has to the problem. He was standing over me. I want to be precise about this, because precision is what I owe the account and what I owe everyone who might read it. And because imprecision about this particular moment would be a kind of dishonesty I am not willing to practice. He was standing over me in the way something stands over something it has put on the ground, not the posture of alarm, not the posture of something that has reacted to a threat, but the full, settled posture of something that has done what it intended to do and is now present to the result. His height over me in that moment was the height of a landscape feature, of something the terrain contained rather than something that moved through it. The full dimensions of him in that moment were not the dimensions I had spent 12 years adjusting to in the modified rooms and the trail corridors. They were something else. They were what he was. His face, and I was looking at his face the way you look at the only information available to you when every other option has been removed, was not a face I recognized from 12 years of mornings in this corridor. It was not the face I knew, or rather, it was the face I knew stripped of everything I had ever read as familiar in it. The same features, the same individual quality I could identify across a drainage, but the expression on them was something I had no entry for in 12 years of careful filing. Not anger in the human sense, not the territorial aggression of a bear defending a kill or a raptor defending a nest. Something older than those categories and less willing to fit inside them. Something that had been present in him, I understood in that moment, for longer than it had been visible to me. Something that the morning and the ridgeline and whatever had come down through the corridor to speak to him had brought to the surface of him the way cold water brings the color out of certain stones. He brought one arm down across my chest with a force that drove what little air remained in my lungs out of them entirely. I did not lose consciousness. I want to be accurate about this, because losing consciousness would have been a mercy, and the morning did not offer mercy. I remained fully present to every second of what followed, which is its own category of experience. The experience of being fully aware of a situation that exceeds your capacity to respond to it, aware of every detail, registering and filing with the automatic precision of a mind that has been trained to observe, while the body beneath the registering is simply pinned and waiting. The weight of his arm across my chest was not the weight of something that had miscalculated. It was measured. It was the exact weight of a thing that knew precisely how much weight it was applying and had chosen that amount specifically. The sound he made above me was nothing I had ever filed. Not the fear vocalization, not the contentment sound, not the structured language sound I had heard him exchange with the ridgeline minutes before. This was something that came from a register below all of those, below the sounds I had cataloged, and the sounds I had observed, and the sounds that had produced in me the particular quality of comprehension that 12 years of attention makes possible. It was not communication. It was not expression of a state. It was simply a sound that came out of him the way steam comes out of ground that is under pressure. Involuntary, geological, evidence of something operating at a depth that the surface had not previously advertised. I did not speak to him. I made no sound and no movement. This was not a decision I made in the moment. There was no moment in which decision-making was available to me. It was the same instinct that had stopped me at the blowdown cedar 12 years before with my weight on my back foot. The instinct that produced stillness when the available information outpaced interpretation. The stillness was the only thing I had to offer, and I offered it completely, the way you offer the only thing you have when everything else has been taken from the inventory. For how long he stood over me, I cannot accurately report. My internal count, which I trust in the field, was not functioning. The April light continued its ordinary movement through its ordinary stages, which told me time was passing, which told me nothing about how much. The creek continued behind us. The drainage continued its April work. The world did not stop to accommodate what was happening inside it, which is the world's consistent practice, and one I have always respected, but which in that particular passage of time I felt with a new quality of specificity. Then the weight of his arm lifted. Not gradually, not in the way that someone who has been holding something down releases it as a considered act. The weight was there, and then it was not there, and the removal of it had the same quality of abruptness as the arrival of it had, which was, without warning, without announced intention, without reference to anything I could have predicted from any prior observation. He stepped back. I did not move. I continued to apply the only available strategy, which was complete stillness, and I held it until I was confident the holding was a choice rather than a necessity. The confidence took time to arrive. When it arrived, I turned my head, slowly, in the way you turn your head when you are not yet ready to commit the full body to motion. He was standing at the edge of the drainage, not close, not over me. At the margin, where the root mass gave way to the open ground of the creek bottom, the same place I had watched him stand dozens of times when he was reading something in the distance that I did not yet have access to. His back was partially toward me, not completely. There was still a quality of awareness in the angle of his body that told me I was information he was still receiving, even in the partial turning away. He stood there for a time I did not try to count. Then he started up the slope toward the ridgeline. I lay against the root mass and watched him go. I did not follow. The question of following did not arise as a question. It was simply not available, the way certain options are simply not available in certain terrain conditions, regardless of the desire to access them. He moved at his alone pace. I could identify it from the ground, from the angle of my position against the root mass, from the 12 years of watching it and knowing what it meant. He was moving toward something. He was not looking back. I stayed against the root mass for a long time after he disappeared into the timber on the upper slope. The physical inventory, when I finally ran it, was considerable. 3 ribs that later turned out to be cracked rather than broken. The distinction matters clinically and mattered very little in the drainage that morning. A laceration at the back of my skull from the root mass, not deep enough to require stitching, but deep enough to bleed with the particular persistence of scalp wounds. The chest where his arm had come down would produce a bruise over the following days that was unlike any bruise I had produced in 22 years of field work. The extent of it, the depth of the color, the clarity of the pressure pattern it left in the tissue, a record of force applied with a precision that I found myself examining in the mirror at the residence in the days that followed, with the same careful attention I gave to everything else I filed. I was cold by the time I got up. The April ground had done what April ground does when you are on it long enough without moving. I got to my feet using the root mass for support, ran the check that you run after a fall in the field, balance, vision, the inventory of what moves and what does not, and stood in the drainage with the creek sounding behind me and the slope above me showing nothing. He had gone to the ridgeline. I walked back down to the ford and crossed it. I went over on the stepping stones the way I always did. The water was cold and high and moved fast past the stones, and I crossed it with the attention crossings require and came up on the far bank and turned. The far bank was empty. The drainage held nothing visible. Somewhere above the timber line, on the ridge line I could not see from the ford, there were sounds that belonged to a conversation I was not part of. I stood on the western bank for a time I did not count. Then I walked home. He has not come back to the residence since that morning. The porch is quiet. Roper goes to the northeast corner each morning and lies down and listens and comes back inside by mid-morning without the easy patience he used to carry in that vigil. Something changed in it, some quality of the waiting became different, which I attribute to the particular acuity of animals for information that travels below the human threshold. He knows something has changed. He is making his own account of it. People ask me if I think Caleb is coming back. They ask carefully, the way people ask things when they are not sure the question is allowed. I understand the carefulness. What I can tell you is that the question does not sit in me the way questions normally sit. It sits differently from anything I have managed before, not the way an open wound sits, and not yet the way a landscape feature sits. It sits the way something sits that I do not yet have the category for, which is a familiar position and one I have learned over 22 years to hold without forcing closure on it. I have been back to the corridor 11 times since his birthday. I have found sign on 7 of those visits. Prints in the soft earth at the creek margin, at the ford, at the seep crossing on the bench drainage. The prints are fresh, the impressions are clean, the edges sharp, the dew still in the surrounding grass. He is in the country. He is moving through the drainage. He is doing it without me. I look at the photograph in my desk drawer some mornings. He is standing at the edge of the bench drainage where the tree line opens and you can see the ridge line to the north. He is in the posture he took when he was looking at something far off. The stillness, the level head, the arms close to the body in the way that arms are when they are not needed. His back is to the camera. You can see the width of the shoulders and the height of him. I have spent considerable time in the months since his birthday examining what happened at the root mass from every angle available to me, not to reach a conclusion I'm comfortable with. I am not running that kind of accounting, but because precision is what I owe the account, and the account is not finished. What I can say is this: I do not know what arrived in him on that morning. I do not know what the ridgeline sent down through the corridor in the form of percussion and structured sound, and I do not know what it asked of him, and I do not know whether what happened at the root mass was a requirement of what was asked or something else, something prior to the asking, something that had been building in him through 13 years at the edge of 2 worlds and needed a morning and a corridor and a signal from the ridgeline to arrive at its completion. What I have come to, slowly and without comfort, is this: the force he used was not the full force available to him. This is a thing I know with the certainty of someone who spent 12 years in close proximity to what that force could do when it was not being managed, and the force at the root mass was managed, not in the way of something that had decided to hold back out of sentiment. I do not believe sentiment was operating in him in those minutes, or if it was operating at a layer beneath what was producing the behavior. It was managed the way a precise instrument is managed by someone who knows exactly what it measures and exactly how much of its range the measurement requires. He could have killed me. The ribs he cracked were 3 of the 12 I carry. The skull he opened was opened at its surface. The bruise that spread across my chest in the days following was the record of a calculation that had a different outcome available to it and did not take that outcome. I have thought about what that means. I have not finished thinking about it. There are nights when I come back to the moment he looked at me, the 15 seconds of back and forth between my face and the ridgeline before he put his hand on my shoulder. I have examined those 15 seconds from every angle available to me, and what I keep returning to is this: he was not deciding whether to do what he did. He had already decided. What the 15 seconds were was something else. The thing you do when you have made a hard decision and you are taking one last accounting of what it will cost. The look was not asking my permission, and it was not offering me warning. It was something closer to what a person does when they are about to do something that cannot be undone, and they want to hold the before and the after in the same moment for as long as the moment allows. That is the most honest reading I have. I do not know if it is the correct reading. I have come to accept that I will not know. I have not found a way to hold what happened that is both honest and comfortable. I have stopped looking for the version that is both. The honest version is what I have given you. The comfortable version does not exist, and I have been in this work long enough to know that the absence of a comfortable version is not an indication that the account is wrong. It is often an indication that the account is right. The district has a new coordinator this year. He is thorough and well-trained and has asked me twice about my injury. The ribs were noticed at my annual physical in May, the cracked ones having healed in a configuration that left a readable record in the imaging. I told him I had taken a fall on the granite bench above the eastern drainage during the high water survey in April. He accepted this without follow-up. I filed it in the notebook that is not the district notebook, in the section where I keep the things I have said about him to people who did not have the category to receive the truth of them. The section is longer than I would like it to be. It is shorter than I expected it to be. Most people do not ask, because most people do not know there is something to ask about. The corridor has kept its own counsel, the way old terrain keeps counsel, absorbing what moves through it without narrating any of it back. He is in the corridor. The drainage is keeping its own record. The sign is fresh. And I am still in the western section, running the cameras, noting the battery levels, filing what I observe in the notebook that is not the district notebook, the one where the categories do not have to fit, the one where the account can remain open, the way accounts do when what they are recording has not finished yet. I needed a long time at the ford that morning, looking at the empty bank where he had been. I'm still needing it.